We're making a quilt, but not just any quilt, a quilt with carded wool used as the batting. Why? Well, for starters, I own sheep, and so I do want to advocate being self-sufficient and utilizing the resources that you already have. But secondly, wool is an excellent material for natural bedding. It's getting quite trendy now to have natural bedding. No chemicals and no synthetic materials like polyester. In this video, I'm going to show you from start to finish how to make a quilt utilizing carded wool as the batting. We will not focus much on the quilt top, and although that is the fun part and the rather artsy part, you can make any quilt top design that you choose. I want to show you and focus on how to actually assemble this quilt made with sheep's wool. I had some really cool farm panels in my stash, and I told myself one of these days I'm going to get around to it. Well, this is the year I made time to do it. This 8-panel piece I ended up not using for this project. This very large farmall piece here was my favorite. Then I had some smaller farmall squares as well. I decided I would use all of the farmall panels together. So I squared them up. It was a bit challenging to square them up. Ironically, the smaller ones were much harder to square up than the single large one. I laid them on my floor and stared at them for a while, trying to contemplate how to assemble them. This is what I came up with. I ended up using white sashing. I thought the white was quite neutral, of course, and didn't take away from the panels. I really wanted the focus to be on the panels. It was trickier than it appears, as there was a lot of math involved to get this to square up and look symmetrical. With the centerpiece complete, what to do with the rest of the quilt? I did need to get to a king size after all. So after trying some designs and blocks around the quilt, I didn't like it, so I decided to just go with plain solid colors. So I drove to Joann last night in an ice storm, and yes, I picked out a nice farmall red and a black for the backing and border at the end. So I think these colors are going to look really nice. I'm excited. I'm down to the last piece of fabric that I need to sew onto this quilt top. So I have the fabric pre-cut, and I need to clip this down. So rather than using pins, I like to use these wonder clips. For one, it doesn't make a hole in the fabric like pins do. And secondly, the projects that I do are very large, often queen or king quilts. So because they're so large, they're very heavy, and with all that heaviness, there can be a lot of shifting of the fabric. So I want to be able to pin it every inch or less to minimize that shifting. Let's clip this 110 length fabric down. Start by laying your fabric right sides together. I like to work from left to right. Initially, I'm just going to roughly lay it out. Now I'm coming back to the upper left corner and clipping it correctly. I'm using my thumbs and making sure that the two fabric edges are flush to each other. I'm using lots of clips, possibly an inch or less of spacing. Remember, I'll be taking this giant unit to my sewing machine, and it will be draped on my lap and onto the sewing machine table. There's a lot of weight with a piece this big, so the more clips, the better. I'm not too worried about wrinkles right now. I'm just concentrating on lining up the two edges. Let me tell you, I sure listened to a lot of Christmas music while making this quilt. And the YouTube Music app had to keep asking me, "Are you still watching?" Yep, I sure was. It really was a special treat being home on vacation getting to make this quilt. So you can flip that over and check that it's lined up. You can see that the fabric front and back is nice and flush. And now I've taken it to my sewing machine and I'm sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance. As I'm sewing along, I remove the wonder clips and I place them in a Rubbermaid container on the right-hand side of the sewing machine. Once I finish sewing this, I will take it to the ironing board and iron the seams to the side. Although it was difficult to square up and make symmetrical a panel quilt, it did come to size much faster than a traditional pieced quilt. I'm here with my finished quilt top. Drum roll please, and to quote my favorite movie, she's a beaut, Clark. So again, this is a king size. I can't quite spread my arms amongst the whole width, so we're going to slide down the quilt. Oops. Pretty cool. Very happy to use up my Farmall panels. So now I can show you how we assemble a quilt. So to layer the quilt, I will be using muslin. You can also use cheesecloth. So we will have the quilt top, a layer of muslin, the quilt batting, or the carded wool in this case, another layer of muslin, and then the quilt backing. I prefer muslin over cheesecloth. I feel like it's, not quite as spacious as cheesecloth, and it's also affordable compared to regular fabric, in other words, and I don't need it to be very thick. It needs to be thin. Muslin is sold on the bolt, just like regular fabric. I have several bolts of 36-inch muslin. You can see that the price is much more economical than your higher quality fabric. So muslin is very thin. If you look at it closely, it's very thin and lightweight, and that's why I'm choosing to use this in place of cheesecloth. I do have some muslin that is 44 inches wide, so obviously you can get it wider, but you're going to pay more for that. So I prefer to get the 36-inch bolts, and if you can use a coupon or get it on sale, you're good to go. The muslin layer needs to be cut and sewn into the same dimensions as the quilt top. So since I have my muslin on the bolt, I'm unrolling it on the floor. My sewing table and cutting mat is definitely not long enough to accommodate this. So I roll it on the floor. I need to cut 3 98-inch long strips, and this muslin is 36 inches wide, so I'm cutting 3 strips, and I'm also going to have to cut an odd 3.5-inch strip and splice that in as well. So I literally just use a tape measure on the floor. I'm not worried about being accurate with the muslin because this is just in the interior of the quilt. Nobody's going to see it. So it's really not as important to be that accurate. Otherwise, I would normally iron it out, put it salvage to salvage, and be much more accurate. This is just fine for the interior muslin. So I've marked my 98-inch length. I marked it with a pencil as well. And I'm going to be using my cutting mat and ruler on the floor. If you want to be somewhat particular, I'm lining up the cutting line on the salvage edge, and of course I'm at the 98. Yes, there are wrinkles in the muslin, but again, this does not need to be accurate. This is just interior of the quilt. All right, so there is my 98-inch strip by 36 wide. So I need to cut 2 more of these and an odd one, and then we'll sew them together. I'm rolling out that bolt all along the floor, measuring it with the tape measure, sliding that cutting mat underneath, measure twice and cut once. Put lots of weight onto your ruler and cut. All right, there is my second piece of 36 by 98. I'm excited, and this is why you should always keep your scraps. I will save fabric scraps all the way down to 2.5 by 2.5 inches. And I did save my muslin scraps here, left over from a previous quilt. And this is just perfect because I really need this odd 3.5 wide by 98 long strip of muslin. And so now I don't have to cut into the nice big full size off the bolt. I can just use these scraps. Now it's not quite 98, so I'm going to take this smaller piece. I'm going to seam this together here. I'll have my length, and then I will trim it down to 3.5. So yay, my scraps saved the day. I'm just putting on a couple of clips real quick here. Again, with the muslin, I'm not going to be too particular because this is just going in the interior of the quilt. But I need to get down to that 98 length. So let's join these two scraps together, 1/4 inch seam. All right, I'll take this to the iron. I'm going to iron open that seam, and then I will cut it to length. I'm so happy I can use my scraps. Normally when I'm doing a seam, especially on sashing, I'll do this nice mitered corner here, this mitered seam. But with the muslin, again, I just did just a basic straight line. I didn't bother to do a nice miter because, again, this is just going in the interior of the quilt and nobody will see it. I will put this scrap of muslin back into my muslin tote, and you never know, I can use that scrap on the next quilt. I'm taking just a few extra minutes to iron out this muslin. Now, it's not necessary to do this. If you were using cheesecloth for the quilt, you wouldn't be ironing the cheesecloth. But I just like to take the extra step. It's nice to have it lay a little bit flatter on the floor because I will be pinning this together and stitching it. So I'm not worrying about removing every single wrinkle. I'm also not going to worry about removing the selvage ends. I will be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that selvage edge will be sewn, just slightly past that. So it will be fine, so no need to do that. So this step is much quicker than the quilt top or the quilt backing. You don't have to remove the selvage, you don't have to worry about getting it perfectly straight, perfectly iron free. It's just a much quicker step. So remember, the purpose of the muslin, or cheesecloth if you choose to do cheesecloth, is to hold the wool, somewhat to hold the wool in place, but mainly to prevent the wool from going through. We don't want the wool to go through the quilt top or the quilt backing. So this will help prevent that. The tying of the quilt will help prevent the wool from shifting or moving around and keep it in place. We will not be machine quilting our wool quilt. So once I finish ironing this up, we will pin this together and stitch it. So I laid down my first piece of muslin. I'm choosing to stitch on the scrap piece next, and then I'll do the other two solid ones. So let's start by laying this down. Again, I'm going to use my Wonder Clips here to clip it on. Look at that, my cut was actually pretty accurate for doing it on the floor. Just came out at 98. I'm just going to go ahead and smooth that out a little bit. All right, now I will grab my Wonder Clips, and I like to work left to right, so I will start clipping left to right. All right, I got this pinned down. I'll take you up close so you can see what it looks like. So I lined up the edges. Remember, I'm ignoring the frayed part here. So it's fabric to fabric. So now I'll take this to machine and we'll do our 1/4 inch seam. While sewing your 1/4 inch, just ignore the frayed part of the selvage and focus on the fabric edge. Next, we will be ironing the seams. Now that I have my first seam of muslin, I like to iron my fabric to the side. If you want to open your seams and iron them that way, that's fine. I just prefer to iron to the side. Since there is no dark fabric, it's all white, I'm going to pretend like I'm ironing it towards sashing. So I'm going to lift this side, and I'll take my iron and go this way. Okay, so we're holding this up and ironing the seam to the side. I am using some light steam right now. Here's what the underside of the seam looks like with the muslin joined together. And of course the right side with the seam pressed out. My next step is to lay this on the floor again and join the next large piece. I finished the muslin layer, and this is finished off at 98 by 110 inches, sized for my king size quilt. You will now need to make a second one of these because the layering will be the quilt backing, followed by a layer of muslin, the carded wool, another layer of muslin on top of that, and then the quilt top. This will all be tied together. So I'm going to make a second one of these and I'll meet you back. And this is my last seam that I have to sew for the muslin layer. So this example here, I'm actually doing 2 selvages together. So again, I just want to line up the actual fabric line, just ignore the fray or the fuzzy part. And I'm going to clip with the Wonder Clips, just as I did all of the others. Once this muslin layer is completed, we will move on to doing the quilt backing, which is very similar. Now that you've finished sewing your 2 muslin layers, the next step is the quilt backing. For the quilt backing, I highly recommend going to a website called Quilter's Paradise, where they have free calculators to use. This time, instead of making it the same dimensions as the quilt top, we will be making it with a 3-inch overage, meaning we will add 3 extra inches to all 4 sides of the calculator. The reason is I like to use backing as my binding technique. Let's look at this wall hanging as an example. You can see the backing fabric, which is pink, is actually double folded over to the front and made into the binding. This also includes a mitered corner. With that 3-inch overage, we will be cutting it down to 1.5 inches and then doing the binding. For my quilt backing, I'm choosing to do a solid black. I think this will look nicely over the Farmall red quilt panel. I ended up cutting 3 long strips of this size. So I need to sew those 3 strips together to get my backing with the 3-inch overage. So next, just as I did with the muslin layers, I will lay the fabric along the edge here, clip it with the Wonder Clips, and stitch it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once again, lay out the fabric, right sides together, smooth out the wrinkles, and make sure those edges are nice and lined up. Start Wonder Clipping from left to right. I must say that having the knees bent like this reminds me very much of picking green beans for hours in the garden. Just like the muslin layers, we will do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that I have my two backings pinned together, or clipped together, I should say, with the Wonder Clips, I'm ready to do my 1/4 inch stitching here to join these two panels. I just want to show you that I did leave the salvage edge on. Typically, when I'm going to do other quilting, like blocks and other smaller pieces, I would cut that salvage off. But admittedly, I'm a little bit lazy right now because this is such a large piece and I don't really technically need to. So I lined up the two white lines on this salvage when I was clipping it. And of course, I will be sewing a 1/4 inch away from that white line, which will end up right at the edge of the salvage onto the real fabric, so to speak. So it will be fine. This will be folded over underneath is the seam. If you want to, you can cut that off if you'd rather. I just found that with such a large project, I was going to skip that step. Also, I switched out to black fabric. Of course, I was using, white. I was using white thread for the white muslin, and of course now I've replaced it with a black 100% cotton thread. I get all my cotton thread from connectingthreads.com. So now we're using black on black. So to the side of my sewing machine, I'm going to have my Rubbermaid container of the Wonder Clips. So as I'm sewing, I can just remove them and toss them into the container. So keep that real handy next to your machine. Let's remove the first clip. And again, I kept the salvage on. So I have a 1/4 inch quilting foot here. So from the needle to this edge is 1/4 inch. So I'm going to line my 1/4 inch right against the white line from the salvage. And then my stitching will end up, of course, a 1/4 inch in from the line, which will be right on the edge here and right on the edge of the salvage and the real fabric. As I move along, the weight of the fabric needs to be sitting on my lap and shifted upward and to the left. One of the benefits of keeping the salvage on is that I have this nice white line, which is very easy to follow with your eyes. So I like to adjust the weight of this, again, and have it sitting on my lap. So I don't want the weight sitting on the floor and tugging or putting drag on this. So the bottom part, like I said, the weight is on my lap. And then up here, as I'm moving along, I'm going to constantly shift it to the upper left to reduce the weight and drag. So again, I'm just constantly shifting the weight. I want the feed dogs to move the fabric. I don't want any drag or weight pulling on the fabric. And we're at the end. So now I will take this to the ironing board and I will iron open the seam to the side. What's nice about the backing material is that it was 43 inches wide, which is pretty standard width for fabric. So I only need to have 3 sections sewn together. Well, because the muslin was only 36 inches wide, it took a little bit more cutting and piecing together. You can iron your seam again however you want. If you want to iron the seam to the side or press it open, it's up to you. I do like to iron to the side. So starting on the wrong side of the fabric, again, I like to just use a dry iron to press it to the side. And then I will flip it over to the right side of the fabric, and then I will press it open, or press it to the side with steam and get a nice tighter opened seam. I just find that with these larger projects, hitting it with a dry iron on the opposite side first is a little easier. We're just dealing with a lot of weight here. And for this backing, it doesn't matter which way I press the seam. Obviously it's black, all of it's black, so there is no dark side, so to speak. Just iron it to whichever side you choose. Easy peasy. I don't know about you, but does anybody else find ironing a little bit therapeutic? I don't know, it's kind of like a stress reliever for me, just ironing out the wrinkles and making it look nice. It's kind of a stress reliever. Can be. Kind of like pulling weeds in the garden. Only I think this is probably better than that. Sometimes weeding the garden can actually be stressful, especially when they've gotten out of hand. If I find any stray hairs or threads, I like to pick that up, keep my sewing area clean. Alright, so now that this has been ironed on the wrong side and it's starting to head this way, it will be much easier to do it on the right side now. Let's flip this around. So I'm using a Black & Decker Digital Advantage iron. This is really nice. I recommend it. So it is a steam iron. I bought this specifically for my quilting. I have it on 6, which is for cotton. And right now I'm going to change it to some steam, just a little bit of light steam. We're going to press open the seam really nice now on the right side of the fabric. So since my seams are going this way, you can just double check on the bottom. We want to lift and glide the iron this way. So I'm pressing the seams to my left. I do wish I had just a little bit of a longer cord. But then again, I'm sewing in my basement and my electrical outlets are pretty limited down here. One tip is you want to be checking your bobbin to make sure that you're not running out. So here I did run out. Of course I knew about it because I was watching it. But these, this is such a large quilt being that it's king sized. And so I just left my wonder clips on where I left off. That's fine. I just had to remove the needle. I'll replace the bobbin and I will just start a little bit farther back here and then I will continue on. So no worries. I definitely didn't waste any thread, did I? That's all I had left was that little piece. So I happen to have a black bobbin already filled and ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and continue on. Now that I have all of the pieces made, it's time to start layering. So you start with the quilt backing, and we're going to be placing the quilt backing right side down on the floor and the wrong side facing up. We're going to secure it to the floor with some tape. I recommend painter's tape. Depending on what kind of flooring you have, you just don't want to wreck your flooring, right? So we're going to lay this down. We're going to need a really large area. This is a king-size quilt, so it was quite a challenge for me to find any place in my house. I don't have that big of a house of where I could fit this thing. So unfortunately, we're going to be on my basement floor here, right behind me, in between my wood stove and the cement wall of my basement. Work with what you have, and that's fine. So I'm going to get busy layering this down and taping it down. So check your seams on your backing material to make sure that the right side is facing down, so the nice seam facing down, the wrong side facing up. I'm most likely going to need a second person to help me sprawl this out. First, I just have to make sure that I'm getting it orientated the correct way, because it's just barely going to fit on my floor. Try to spread out all of the wrinkles before taping this down. It is difficult. Grab a second person to help if needed. I have my painter's tape and I'm going to start taping the perimeter down on this end. While one person tapes one edge of the backing, a second person can be on the opposite side, pulling the fabric taut to reduce wrinkling. Once I'm nearing the final edge, I no longer need the second person to pull on the fabric. Now that the backing is secured down with painter's tape, it's time to put the first layer of muslin down. I'm going to place the muslin with the right side facing down and the wrong side facing up. We're going to try to center the muslin, and I want to have, remember I chose to do a 3-inch overage around the perimeter, and the muslin is the same dimensions as the quilt top. So I will be taking my tape measure and checking to see that I have approximately 3 inches around the perimeter. Technically, it wouldn't matter which direction the muslin is facing, since again it's in the interior of the quilt and nobody's going to see it. But just because I'm somewhat particular, I'm going to have the right side facing down. The next layer of the quilt is the wool. Here I have 2 bags of carded wool. This is from my Old English baby doll South Downs. You can use any breed of wool really, but I find that the South Down wool makes really great warm quilts. Plus it has a shorter staple length, so it's not my favorite to spin. I anticipate that I'll be using possibly all of this because this is a king-sized quilt. I also chose the darker wool to just use that up. I do have some lighter, more white wool as well. Just keep in mind what your quilt color is. If you have a lot of white in your quilt, you're really not going to want to have a lot of dark wool in it. I would stick to the white wool. If you have a dark quilt, go ahead and use the darker colored wool, just to be safe. It's likely not going to show through because we have so many layers with the muslin, but just choose accordingly. In order to get carded wool, you need to have wool that's been sheared from the sheep, picked through or skirted, and washed and air dried. From there, you need to take that wool and card it. Be sure to check out my video. I've got a whole playlist on wool processing, but the wool does need to be carded into bats. Now, most homeowners are going to have a small drum carder, right? If you take it to a woolen mill, you can get a queen size bat, 60 by 80 inches, so pretty large, because commercial mills have a very large carding machine, right? At home, we're going to have smaller ones. My largest carder is the Luette extra large drum carder. That actually makes pretty large bats. So what you'll do is line them all together in a layer. So say your bat is like this size, right? You're going to just lay it along this whole thing. What I'm trying to say is it doesn't have to be one giant bat. It's okay to layer the bats. I don't recommend using roving. Roving is more of a strip that you would take to your spinning wheel to spin into yarn. We want bats. Now, if you don't have your own wool or your own sheep, I do have an Etsy store, so check it out. I do sell some of the wool, so you can give this a try yourself. Here's an example of some wool bats that I did do on my Louette extra large drum carder. So that is a manual carder that I own. I do have a video using that as well. So let's just show you an example of how you would do this if you're doing your own carding. Basically, you would be layering them because these are small, right? These are small pieces. This is not from a woolen mill. This is done here at home manually. So I would just lay them on the muslin, side by side. These are nice rectangular bats. And you would continue on layering these bats until you get to the width and length that you desire. Now you're going to want to stay within your muslin layer. You can also choose to make it as thick or thin as you want. This would be obviously a single layer. But let's say I wanted to have a really, really lofty quilt. Well, if I wanted to, I suppose I could do a double layer. I would be a little bit careful just to not get too thick and lofty where you actually could potentially not be able to hand tie through it. So just be careful not to overdo it. But basically, the possibilities are up to you. So that's how you would use homemade carded bats. Like I said, the roving is going to be kind of a long snake-like piece that goes to the spinning wheel. So that's not something that it would be very difficult to layer a roving. It's skinny, long pieces. So definitely use bats. Now, I do have some large carded wool, so I'm going to stick to the large stuff because I happen to have some, and I want to use it up for my quilts. But when the day comes that I use up these larger ones, this is how I'll be doing it with my hand carded bats here. So let's move on to the actual wool that I'm using today. Okay, come back. So let's open up a bag of the larger wool bats that I'm using. Now you notice that they're stored in a clear bag. Moths are a problem with wool. I love natural products. I like not having, chemicals or any synthetic materials. Unfortunately, bugs and moths also like organic materials. So it is a challenge with wool in the house. The clear bag will allow sunlight to go through it. And we like to just take little chunks of cedar wood and put it in our bags of wool. I don't mind. The smell of cedar is pretty nice, right? And it's supposed to repel moths. And it's natural. I don't like the idea, personally, of using mothballs in my house. I'd prefer to be chemical-free if possible. So we literally just go out with a chainsaw and get some chunks of cedar wood. So we're going to start with this bag because it's already been opened and I've torn some of it off. This one is actually going to be a full 60 by 80. So let's open this one. I'll set the cedar wood aside. The goal here is that we're going to be placing the wool layer just on the muslin. So it's a nice visual here because you can see the white muslin against the black backing fabric. We do not want to have the wool go beyond the muslin. This is a mistake that I've learned in the past from all the quilts I've made in the past. I'll be taking that backing fabric, folding it over for the binding. And I will need to machine stitch that on my sewing machine. So we do not want to get the wool into that area where the binding is going to be, because then it's very challenging to get the sewing machine to go through it. Lessons learned from my mistakes in the past. So try really hard to keep that wool within the muslin fabric area, because the muslin fabric is the same size as the quilt top. So let's go ahead and take this out of the bag. We're going to set this one aside. And let's just see what we have here for size. Oh, I just love the feel. The baby doll wool is so springy and bouncy. It just has a totally different feel than the Shetland wool. I have quite a bit of Shetland wool as well as a Suffolk right now too, and some mixed breeds as well. But the baby doll wool, it is just so bouncy, springy. It's fun. I like it for quilts. It's fantastic for quilts. So I do have both white and black baby dolls. I have more white than black. So obviously this is going to be the black baby doll since this is darker. And this was blended. So I didn't separate the black and the white. It's just been blended. So right now I'm just spreading it out just to see what I have here. Oops. Try not to move the muslin. So this is actually a bigger piece than I thought. I was expecting this to be just a smaller leftover piece from my last quilt. There's more here than I thought. And this is actually kind of an odd, bat here. I don't remember why I cut this out here. So now I have to decide if I want to, you can either cut this wool with the scissors, or you can actually just stretch it and tear it. Because I have nice large bats, I would prefer, just like when you're dealing with fabric, right? You prefer to keep it whole and as seamless as possible. And I would prefer to keep it whole as seamless as possible with minimal piecing together. Looking at this, I have to decide if I want to use this or crack open the full-sized one. So I think I'm going to unroll the full-sized one as well right now and see what we've got for size. So let's just roll this one aside a little bit. Remember, the ultimate goal here is to fill in the white muslin layer. Now I am going to do a single layer. I'm not going to double it up. This is actually quite thick already, so I'm not going to double layer it. The layer is quite thick and lofty already. And I do like my quilts very thick and lofty. So if your bats are thin, I would be inclined to double it up. We'll get a close-up and I'll show you how thick this batting really is. For now, let's roll this one out. So let's unroll this. So this should be the full-sized here on this one. Again, this is so springy and bouncy. I just love the feel of it. So I'm carefully unrolling it. I'm trying to not tear it right now. So you'll see that there's just some tissue paper. That's what that white is there. There's some tissue paper there to kind of help separate the layers. So I will remove the tissue paper. Set that aside. All right. So you can see that even this queen size bat is on the small side, in my opinion. So we're definitely going to use this entire piece. Plus I will be tearing some off the scrap one to fill it in. So I'm starting by dragging this over to the edge of the muslin. Ideally, it would be nice to have two people helping you do this. Maybe I can ask my cameraman to come in here and help me move this wool, actually. Because I don't want to stretch this too much. I'm basically trying not to tear it. I mean, it can be stretched a little bit, but I like to keep it lofty. So we're actually going to come this way. Okay, I got that corner good. We're gonna come this way. Oh, we're just gonna grab that corner. Yep, there we go. Kind of stretching it out into a nice big square. Okay. I think that's about as stretched out as we want to go with the first one. All right, thank you. So you can stretch this out as much or as little as you want. Again, I like to keep my quilts really nice and thick and lofty. So I'm going to keep them a little bit on the thicker side. Now that I can see how much space the first one is taking up, I've got it pretty good just covering the muslin but not going too much beyond that. So you can see the white muslin here, that's the remainder that I need to fill in. So let's start piecing this together with this one. And I will be tearing this as needed here. Let's see here. Trying to see which side is.
Probably do that long side first.
Yeah. Let's see what it looks like going this way. So I kind of have this straight edge lined up alongside the muslin here on my left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start tearing the wool at this point. Because I don't want a double layer, I just want a single layer here. So right where it lines up with this one, I'm going to start tearing this apart. And I'm going to have you come in close now. I'd like to show you how easily that the wool tears and how you do not need a scissors. Alright, so here's where I'm making the tear. Just grabbing my hands and not even having to pull that hard, just pulling apart. You can maybe even hear it a little bit. You can see how when I lay that down, we're just going to kind of join that together. Even when you just grab your hands like that and kind of squeeze it, it's going to just seam together real nice. So I'm just going slowly because it's not a perfectly straight line here. I'm just patching in where the other one ends. I've made quilts of all sizes. I've done queen, full, and now this is a king. You can see how thick this wool is. I wish you could feel it on camera. There's no way to convey that, but the feeling of it is very cool. It's very springy and bouncy, very lofty, plush. So once I tear this apart, I will flip it around to the other side and we'll continue patching. Come look at how thick this is up close. Just zoom in here. I just want you to see how thick this bat is. So you can choose the thickness that you want. When you're carding the wool, you get to choose how thick of a bat you want. Of course, you're somewhat limited to the drum carder that you have too. The length or height of the needles on the drum carder limit the thickness of the bat, you can do as well. But in that case, like I said, you can definitely layer them if you want to have more than one. That's fine. Okay, so we can see that we're approaching the end here. I think I will continue tearing this way. All right. I'm also going to tear this little odd piece over here. There's kind of an L shape here coming off of this. So I'm going to kind of join this with my hands. And see how nice that joins? It's not quite as good as if you're a spinner and you spin wool into yarn. You know that wool joins together very nicely. Or if you do any felting. There's no need to felt this, but that would certainly join it together. But even just squeezing it with my hands like that, you can see how smooth of a transition that actually is. It's really quite easy there. If you take a look at that joint, it almost looks seamless. So let's get rid of this odd L shape here. And we'll use this elsewhere. All right. Let's set this odd one aside. And let's see what we have left with this one. So now we have this other white section to fill in. I think this is going to be pretty close. Let's see. Yeah, because we can see this corner here. So because there's this L here, we want to hit this corner. So we're going to go the opposite way. I definitely agree with that. And you know, sometimes you just have to lay it out and visually see it. I think this is going to come out real nice here. We don't want to have any waste. So basically all I have left over here is this kind of odd scrap piece here. I don't think I'm going to need it in this quilt. I may save it for the next one. Let's start joining this together now. I'm going to start with this corner. But this actually filled in very nicely along the muslin here. Again, I really don't need to stretch it out. If you wanted it thinner, you could really stretch on this and get it thin and spread out that way. But I like my quilts nice and thick. My very first quilt I made was a little bit on the thinner side. I think we had stretched it out a little bit more. And then my third quilt was very lofty, probably the thickest, loftiest one I'd ever made. And I personally enjoy that. This one I think will just be kind of medium. I'm not really adding any extra, but I'm also not stretching it at all either. But this is also a king size quilt, so I don't really want to have a lot of extra weight. It's already going to be so huge. I think I will bring that in a little. So I don't want a lot of loftiness on the perimeter or edge of the quilt, which we'll see later when we get to that machine stitching part. Then you can visually understand why. I think this looks great. Yeah. All right, so there we have it. I would say I'm pretty satisfied with this here. The perimeter is all filled in with a single layer all the way up to the edge of the muslin. It's actually really fun to walk on this. It's super springy and bouncy. So now that is completion of laying down the wool. Now we need to get that second layer of muslin and drape that on top. I will go and grab that. So here's my second layer of muslin. Remember, this is the exact same dimensions as the quilt top. I'm going to lay this on top of the wool with the right side facing up. So it's just important right now that I get the exact dimensions. Again, a very large area here that I'm spreading out. I just need to spread it out to see which direction I'm in right now. Okay, I think I'm in the right orientation. The right side is facing up. We're making a sandwich. So I'm going to try to get it just lined up real nice and even with the other muslin layer. And I'm going to pull it taut here because I don't want to have any wrinkles. I'm trying to get it nice and smooth and the fabric nice and taut here. So I'm going to pull on each edge here. It is kind of hard not to step on it. This is such a big area here for me with the king size, so it's okay to step on it a little bit. All right, this is looking good. You can see that it's matching up, the perimeter is matching up with the other muslin. This looks good. So now I'm going to grab the quilt top and I'm going to do the same thing with the quilt top right now. All right, I grabbed my quilt top. This is the pretty part. This is the exciting part that I like to look at. We're going to put this on top. So the orientation of this will match the muslins. I want to mention too that if you don't use muslin, obviously cheesecloth is another alternative. If you're on a budget, you can certainly use any material that's thin. It could be an old curtain. It could be, you know, make do with what you have. We just need a nice thin material. The next step is called basting. Basically, we will take all those layers and we want to pin them to hold them together before we do the tying. There's different kinds of basting pins. First, there's just our regular safety pin, which we all are familiar with that. These are 2-inch regular safety pins. I actually don't recommend this. If this is all you can find, it's better than nothing. But what I really like are curved. So the quilting or basting pins, it's a safety pin with a slight bend or curve in it. This is much better. Now, they come in different sizes. This here is a Dritz. These are 1.5-inch basting pins. So they have the curve, and they are 1.5 inches in length. This is fine for smaller quilts. So a quilt that you're going to use, well, for example, this one here, this is a wall hanging. So this is very thin and flat. This, compared to what I'm used to, this is not thick at all. It's very thin and flat. What I put inside here was 100% cotton batting that I bought from Joann Fabrics. So it's very thin. So this 1.5 inch basting pin will easily pin through these layers. It's very thin, no problem. But for my wool quilts, I hate them. Basically, the 2 inch is essential. I wish they sold 3 inch. I'd get a 3 inch one if I could, but as far as I've been able to find, the 2 inch is the biggest. So definitely invest in these 2 inch curved basting pins. And let's head down to the quilt and I'll show you how to do it. I've got my basting pins. Let's start in the center of the quilt. You're going to find that it's actually very difficult to pin through all of the layers. The purpose of doing the basting is I don't want things to shift around. Yes, I do hate poking holes in the quilt, but it is necessary. So I'm feeling with the pin, I can feel the floor, so I know I've gone all the way through because I can feel my cement floor with the pin here. Now this is the tricky part, is coming back up and through. You can see, because my quilt is so thick, I went all the way to the edge here. There's a lot of material here. So I'm starting in the center of the quilt, and I'm going to gradually work my way out and away. Now, right now I'm going to try to keep the painter's tape secured to the floor for as long as I can. Once I start moving out and away, you may have to pick up the painter's tape and move it to get underneath the fabric layers. But if you can, try to keep the painter's tape on as long as possible to reduce shifting. So we're going to continue now, working our way outward. Go through, all the way through to the bottom. Try to feel that you've gone through all the layers. And come back up. And you can see, look how much, I don't have very much pin coming through, because when I've gone through all these thick layers, it's so thick, I don't have very much extra of the pin. So I kind of have to hold my finger down and get it under there. And it's using up the whole 2 inch. I wish I had bigger than 2 inch. I just haven't been able to find any. So you can see now, if you pick this up, all the layers are through that pin. But you can see how nice that curve is. Where it really shines is when you're coming back up. So I'm going, it's easy to poke down through the fabric. It's the coming back up part here that's really hard with these thick quilts. So a straight safety pin is even more difficult to come back up through. I've done it, and I definitely recommend the curved. Anything to make your life easier is worth it usually, if there's a better way. Alright, so that one's good. Now as far as how many pins to do, I don't really have a specific number for you. As many as it takes to get it from not shifting around too much. Personally, I don't do a ton of pinning, not nearly as much as the hand tying. I just want it to stay in place good enough for me to start doing the hand tying. These aren't going to stay in forever, they're just temporary. But I also don't really like poking a lot of holes into my fabric either. You know, I like my wonder clips better than my pins. So I don't overdo it on the basting. The purpose is to keep everything from shifting around. When we hand tie this quilt, I will have the paint removed, the painter's tape removed, and I often have it kind of on my lap and folded over. so it will be moved around. So these basting pins will hold it in place for that purpose. So keep working out and away from the quilt. And once I get some more of these basting pins in, I will meet you back. Here's a nice close-up, making sure I hit the bottom of the floor, coming back up, and pinning. Then I like to give it a little tug, and you can see I've gone through all of the layers. When basting the perimeter, check for wool that is too far out. Here's an example where the wool is definitely way past the muslin. So I'm going to take a minute to tuck that in. So go ahead and tuck it further into the center of the quilt and pull the muslin and quilt top back out nice and taut. Then I will take my basting pin and paste it into this position. Again, making sure to go all the way down. I can touch the floor with the pin and back up. Again, checking the whole perimeter. Pull that fabric nice and taut, keep the wool back into the center, and pin. This will make the machine quilting of the binding so much easier. I've completed putting all of the basting pins in. I actually ran out of my nice curved ones, so I had to resort to some of the regular stainless steel or straight safety pins, so I definitely need to order some more for myself. So you can take a close look here just to see how many I did in the spacing. Please note that on the perimeter of the quilt, or on the edge here, I went really heavy with the pins because it's very important to me to keep the perimeter from shifting. And I have fewer in the center of the quilt. Again, I don't really have a written, you have to have so many per inch. What you feel comfortable with to keep it in place. But I do highly suggest having the perimeter heavily pinned. So now I'm ready to remove the painter's tape, and we're going to start hand tying this quilt. But in order to hand tie the quilt, I will need to have it kind of under my lap as I'm sitting on the floor. So it's okay to move the painter's tape at this time, so I'm going to go ahead and peel that up. And of course, since it's painter's tape, it peels up very nicely. We're not having any damage to the fabric or my flooring. All right, all of the painter's tape is off, and now the quilt is technically mobile. So I will be able to roll it up over my lap to start doing the hand tying. So next, let's talk about hand tying. These are the materials that you will need for hand tying the quilt. You will need 100% cotton yarn. This is the brand that I typically purchase. It comes in a large cone. It's approximately 706 yards. This one I've used in the past to match my baby doll wool on a loom, and it was really cool. For this quilt, I'm probably going to use the white and maybe black. I'm kind of undecided, but probably for sure white. And we will need some metal yarn needles to go through the quilt with the yarn. So these are pretty large compared to your typical needle. They are over 3 inches in length. This is my favorite one that I like to use. So just comparing them, this one has a larger eye hole, and this one is slightly smaller. Of course, the larger eye hole will be easier to thread through when you're threading the yarn through the hole. The smaller one will be more difficult to thread through. However, the smaller one will make a smaller hole in the fabric, and the larger one, of course, will make a larger hole in the fabric. So I choose to have a little bit more difficult threading, but then a smaller hole in the quilt. I believe these are also called darning needles. To thread the needles, I do not recommend the threaders, the wire threaders, where this is what you would use for on a sewing machine for a regular thread, and it's a really flimsy wire. These will break. I've done it before. It's just too flimsy for thick yarn like this. So make sure that you get these thicker, more aluminum threaders. So when you're threading, this goes through the eye hole. The yarn will go through that hole, and you pull the yarn through, and it's ready to go. Because you're going through so many thick layers on the quilt, remember we've got backing, muslin, wool, muslin, and quilt top. That's a lot of layers. Your finger can get a little sore going through all those layers. So you may want to use a metal thimble on your finger to help push it through all those layers as you're going up and down, up and down. Also, what I really recommend is one of these non-slip kitchen grips. Typically you would have these in your kitchen when you can't open a jar or a lid. Very grippy. I like these. So I will use that to grab hold of the needle and go up and down. It does get a little tiring after time, and the needles get to be slippery. Your hands might get sweaty. It's really nice to grab hold of the needle with that to go up and down. And of course the scissors to be trimming the ties. The spacing for hand tying a quilt is every 8 to 10 inches. But don't get too hung up on that spacing. Please consider the aesthetics of your quilt top. For starters, it's nice to choose a yarn color that matches your quilt. This one's simple. I've got white on white. You can choose any color that matches your quilt top, but also the placement of the ties. I often like to do it on the sashing here. Also, when you're doing more traditional quilt blocks that are blocks and pieces together, it's nice to do it at the points or corners. And also for a square this size, I've placed one directly in the center of the square and then the surrounding sashing. I will also show you some examples of other quilts I've made and where I put ties on those. Let's get busy threading the yarn. So grab your darning needle. Oops, I left it on the quilt. All right, you can get up close here. We're going to thread my aluminum threader through the eye hole here. Unravel some of your yarn from the cone. Yes, it's a little old-fashioned, but a little spit goes a long way on the end of the yarn. This is a 4-ply cotton yarn, so it's a little tricky to get it through that hole. A little bit of spit and twisting will help you get it through the hole. Pull that through, and now pull the aluminum threader through. It will pull hard because this is thick yarn. All right, and we're through. Now I'm going to grab about 1.5 arms length of yarn. I don't measure it precisely, but it's better to grab a longer piece and tie several ties before you have to come back and rethread this again, because it is a little bit of a hassle to stop and rethread. So approximately 1.5 arms length. Grab your thimble and your grip, and we also need the scissors and the tape measure. Remember that the painter's tape has now been removed, so the quilt is mobile at this point. And I will be putting it on my lap. And we will have to fold it over and bunch it up a little bit, just because of the nature of the large size of this quilt. So we're going to scoot in, get this quilt on your lap. We're going to continue on with the pattern that I'm doing here with these smaller side panels. So I need one right here in the center. So let's start there. Start by placing the needle where you want to go, and I've got the thimble on my index finger. Push down from the top all the way through to the bottom, so through all of the layers. Set your thimble aside. Now I'm grabbing the kitchen grip and I'm going underneath the quilt, finding that needle and grabbing hold of it. Pull down really hard. You're going to pull all the way through. Watch this yarn, and I'm going to stop and leave about a 2-inch tail here. Okay? Then, grab your needle, go back underneath the quilt. Now we're not going to flip the quilt back and forth, upside down and top. That would take forever, and it's just too large of a quilt to do it that way. I also do not have a quilt stretcher, but because this is a lofty quilt, it's okay to do it this way. So go back underneath the quilt and feel with your finger. I'm feeling with my left hand here, with my index finger. Feel the yarn that you just pulled through. And then take your needle just about 1/8 of an inch to the left of that from the underside. And now we're going to poke through the top. You can see the needle coming through here. So about 1/8 of an inch, it's very close. And I like to just come right up to the left side of where I entered. Now that it's partially through, I'm going to again grab it with this kitchen grip, grasp it tightly, and pull through. Set that down. And then what I like to do is grab this short tail and pull on it a little bit to the right. Okay, so once you pull hard enough and you can see this other end move, then you know you're all the way through and tight. If you want, you can even rock it back and forth and pull it to the left too, like that. We want to prevent any loops or gaps from the underside of the quilt. So by tugging it to the right or to the left, we know that it's nice and firm here. Now we need to tie a square knot. So we want to take the right and go right over left and cinch down. Now, left over right and cinch down. It's kind of like the righty-tighty, lefty-loosey saying. If you want to say right over left and left over right, you can say it out loud to keep you straight. And that is your square knot. Now we want to tie off the tie to an equal length. I like to do mine at 2 inches. I would recommend 1.5 to 2 inches, but you can choose whatever aesthetic you like. Just make sure that they are tied consistently throughout your entire quilt so that it looks nice. So with the tape measure, here I'm going to cut right at 2 inches. And that tie is complete. If you look at the other ties on the quilt, you can see that they are all cut at 2 inches and they are consistent. If you want to see what that looks like underneath the quilt, let's take a look. Of course, you can see the basting pins, so it will be puckered there. Here is a tie, and here is a tie. So they're pretty small on the underside. Not a lot of it is going to show. Let's tie another one. So being consistent with my pattern, my next one will be here. Again, push down with the thimble. Grab the kitchen grip. Go underneath and pull. Like I said, it does pull very hard. You get kind of used to it after doing hundreds of them. Okay, I'm feeling with my finger where that yarn is. Put the needle right by it and just slightly to the left, about 1/8 of an inch. See the needle coming through? So one tip I wanted to mention is that when you're If the wool is going to pull and come through the quilt, this is when it will happen. So you do need to pull on one of these ends here like that to get it tight, right? We don't want any gaps. And you can even see, zoom in right here. You can see just a little bit here. A little bit of that gray there is the wool. There's just a little bit here. So when I'm pulling the yarn back and forth, some of the wool does want to come up through the hole you're making. So just be cognizant of that. Let's look at other examples of where I place hand ties. This quilt is a very classic quilt with your traditional blocking. I chose white thread or white yarn against white fabric. And I went consistently around the block on the sashing and also at certain points within the block. On this quilt, I used black yarn against black fabric. Again, I usually want to conceal the hand ties and have it blend in with the color or design. You can see that I skipped the corner pieces. I didn't want to have black on the green, so I stayed within the black sashing. And because these really weren't patchwork, these were just, I believe, 12 by 12 squares, I chose to just do one single centered right in the middle of the block. This sheep quilt is basically similar in design to my tomato and corn quilt. Again, I used black yarn within the black sashing, not in the corner pieces, and I did a single in the center of the block. So just a different design than the patchwork. Patchwork versus square blocks. On the back of this quilt, I did not do the 1/8 distance for hand tying. And by spacing it farther away, on the back of the quilt you will have, of course, a longer string showing. So you won't just get a nice little discreet pucker. You're going to actually have a bar, or what I would call a bar of the yarn showing. So that's undesirable. Also here you can see some of the wool is coming through as well. So we want to avoid that. So this was my very first quilt that I made. And so, of course, I've learned as I've gone along over the years what to do and what not to do. And this is the correct tying. By placing the ties about 1/8 away from each other, you'll have a nice small puckering on the back. And here is the finished hand tying. I ended up putting in more hand ties than I initially anticipated, especially in the center panel. Keep in mind that when this quilt is washed over the years, those yarn hand ties will get fuzzier and look a little nicer. Now that the hand tying is complete, go ahead and remove all of the basting pins. Now that my quilt is completely tied and I've removed all of the basting pins, it's time to cut the backing. You will need a rotary cutter, a ruler, a quilting ruler, and a cutting mat to protect your floor. Come on close and we'll take a look. Remember when we first cut this, and when I first made the backing material, we included a 3-inch overage, meaning that the fabric was going to be 3 inches beyond the quilt top. Of course, now that we've pinned it and actually tied this, it's not always going to be an equal 3 inches of overage because there's been moving and shifting. You can see on this end, of course, I have way more than 3 inches, and this is probably about 3 inches, more accurate. Please note that we have pulled the material taut after removing the pins, but because this is a lofty quilt, there will be lumps and bumps here. You're not going to get every wrinkle out, and this is not meant to lay perfectly flat, as are quilts with traditional batting, which is very thin. We will be using the ruler, and I like to do 1.5 inch for the final cut. We will be using the backing as binding, so this will eventually be folded over to the top of the quilt. So with all of the quilts I've made in the past, I always cut them down to 1.5 inch. You could potentially choose a different size if you would prefer. This will affect the size of the binding that goes over. You could potentially have a very narrow binding or a very thick binding. It's your choice, but I always do 1.5 inches. So you will need to find the 1.5 inch mark on your ruler, and you'll need to put that 1.5 inch line on the quilt top. So in this case, the red fabric is the finished quilt top. Ignore the muslin. Now, this is true that this will not be perfectly squared because the quilt is lumpy and bumpy, so to speak, with all the lofty filling in it. That's okay. Don't stress out about that. This is not a wall hanging. Go ahead and cut down your cutting mat using firm pressure. And I'm actually going to stop midway there. Now I'm going to slide my cutting mat forward. And I'm intentionally choosing to cut small distances at a time. So yes, it will take a while to do the entire perimeter of this quilt. Continue on the entire length of the quilt in this fashion. So I'm switching rulers that I'm using for cutting the backing. Why? Because I made a mistake with this one and I accidentally cut it at 1.25 inches. Admittedly, it was pretty hard to see the black lines for this purpose. Not going to stress out about it. Mistakes happen with quilting. It's still going to look okay once it's folded over, especially over the course of a king-size quilt, which is very big. But I do want to show you this other ruler I'm using. It's a little bit easier to see the lines. So if you have this type of ruler instead, I find it to be a little bit easier to see these dotted lines against the red fabric. The previous ruler had black lines, which were much more difficult to see compared to these yellow lines. So there we're at 1.5 inches on the red fabric. And there we have it. It's time to do the binding. So like I said previously, I used the backing for the binding. So we're going to start by doing the left and right sides of the quilt. The first thing you'll need, of course, is lots and lots of wonder clips. As you can see, I've got a nice big Rubbermaid container here. You will need lots of them for a queen or king quilt. Step 1 is to fold in the side fabric one time. So the backing fabric, in my case, is black. You fold it over to meet the edge of the quilt top, which in my case here is the red fabric. Again, we're going to fold it one time so the edge of the backing meets up flush with the edge of the quilt top. Just like that. Take your wonder clip to hold that in place and give that a clip. We're going to repeat this down the entire length of the side. You don't have to clip quite as heavily. We will be folding it a second time. So for this first folding, I don't use quite as many clips. Also, just ignore the muslin. If your muslin layer is going beyond the quilt top, that's okay, just ignore that. We're looking at the quilt backing and the quilt top. Continue down the entire left side with the single fold. Now that we have the first fold, we're going to do a second fold. At this point, we do not need to worry about the corner. I like to remove 2 clips at a time. We're going to fold it over a second time. So we're bringing, here's the first fold. We're bringing the backing up and over the top. At this point, the corner is just a straight line. So you can see how the backing is now coming over the top of the quilt and forming a nice little border here. So continue doing this second fold and clipping until you reach the end of the left side. So the left side has been folded twice and clipped. So this is what it should look like. Again, the corner is straight and moving along. All of the backing is over the top of the quilt top fabric. Now we will repeat this on the right side of the quilt. To make room on my floor, I'm going to pull this back and head to the right side of the quilt. I'm starting with the left-hand corner. Same thing as before. Taking your backing fabric and folding it over once to meet the edge of the quilt top. Again, we're ignoring that muslin. We're looking at the black and red here. We want a nice flush edge. Let's go ahead and do the second fold. Again, we're keeping the corner straight on this. We're on the right side of the quilt. Up and over the quilt top. The left and right sides of the quilt are folded over twice. Now we're doing the top and bottom. This is where we make the corners of the quilt. On the bottom of the quilt, take your left binding, fold it to the left, making a triangle, Let's repeat that. Fold it to the left, making a triangle. The black fabric is still flush with the red quilt top. Place your finger to hold that there. And now continue folding one fold where the black backing meets the red quilt top. So this part is the same as the sides, where one fold edge to edge. The only difference was we made that triangle at the corner. When we fold it over twice, this will make a nice mitered corner. Continue doing this single fold all the way to the corner. Now we can make our nice pretty mitered corners. Just like we did with the left and right sides, go ahead and make your second fold, top coming over. You can see where this now makes a nice 45-degree mitered corner. Let's clip that to hold it. And of course you can adjust your fold as needed. And there is a mitered edge. Continue on down the line doing the second fold, just as we did with the left and right sides. Now we're going to fold the top of the quilt. Again, we're going to take our corner, make that triangle, the top of the triangle is flush with the top of the quilt top. Holding your finger there to hold that. Do one fold up, again so the backing is flush with the quilt top. Place a clip here to hold that. Again, you will make a single fold all the way down the quilt. Now when we come back to do the second fold, let's take a look at that. Undo your clips. Keep holding that still. And fold this up and over for the second fold. Clip that to hold it. Here are two examples of wall hangings and the binding. The wall hangings, of course, are very thin with no wool batting inside, so the binding is much easier to sew and you will get a much neater mitered corner with these types of quilts. The lofty quilt still has a nice mitered corner, but it will not lay as flat. I finished clipping the entire perimeter of the quilt. You can see that I like to use a lot of clips. I like to give the quilt a once over to make sure everything looks good before I take it to the sewing machine. Come in and check the corners. Make sure you're happy with your miters. That looks pretty decent. I do use additional clips on the corners. If you're going to use less clips, use it in the middle of the quilt. I definitely have a clip at least every inch. I would say less than an inch. And finally, let's check this one. And this is a very nice looking mitered corner. Now when we take this to the sewing machine, we're going to be sewing not a 1/4 inch seam allowance like we would typically do with quilting. We'll be sewing right along the edge of this binding. So the inner edge, not the outer edge. We'll be sewing on the inner edge. What's important is that we want to catch the quilt top, so the red fabric in this case. It's very easy for this red fabric to slip out from here, and that's a problem. And this has happened to me in the past, which I have learned from this. So we want to make sure that that quilt top is good and tucked underneath your mitered border here. Hence, using lots of clips will help avoid that problem. Taking the quilt to the sewing machine, I want to show you exactly where to stitch on the binding. So I'm just at the edge of the inner border of the binding. I'm not using my 1/4 inch foot or 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm literally on the edge of that inner binding. Be careful not to sew any pieces of yarn into the binding. Now we're approaching a corner. Of course, we still want to sew that inner edge. I need to pay a little more attention to where my needle is. So often leave the needle in. Let's go forward one. And another one. Leave the needle down. I'm going to lift the presser foot. And let's turn it and see where we're at. We should be pretty close here. Again, there's a lot of weight with this quilt here, so take your time adjusting all of the weight. Look at that. That was a pretty good guesstimate there. So now we can lower, get the pin out of the way. Now when I lower the presser foot, I'm at the same as I've been doing along the other edge. So now we can continue forward. And of course we will continue downward using this seam allowance along the whole length until we get to the next corner. So I just want to show you how much drape there is with a king size quilt on my sewing table. So obviously quite a bit is going to be going onto the floor. What I try to do is get as much of it on my lap as I can, so I don't want so much drag pulling and weighing down on the needle here and making it crooked or puckered. So there's quite a bit here that's going to be on my lap, which as I'm going along I'll lift. And as I go along, I'm constantly moving this quilt up to the upper left. And I want to get as much weight onto the table as I can as I'm going along. Now obviously this is quite big, even for my sewing table. My sewing table is a refurbished table I got on Facebook Marketplace that I refurbished. Of course, I have my container next to me for depositing my Wonder Clips. Again, shifting the weight as much as possible, making sure that that's tucked underneath, that the red is tucked underneath the black. And I use my thumb here and I kind of pull this taut every so now and then. So this quilt is going to definitely have a lot more puckers in it than a flat quilt with very minimal batting. This is just the nature of the beast here. A wool quilt is a very different animal. This particular section here, I don't have as much wool to the edge, so it does make it certainly easier. There were a few sections on the last run I just did where the wool was into the binding a little bit, which I try to avoid, but it's nearly impossible to avoid it 100%. So when you start seeing puckering, I like to remove the clip, adjust the weight, and pull snug on this again. And you can see it's already smoother. So this isn't something that you can just throw on the machine and whip through quickly. It's continual adjusting, continually shifting the weight of the quilt, stopping, taking out your pin. Again, I'm going to tug down on this to make this nice and flat again. And slowly continue onward. Finish sewing all 4 sides of the quilt in this manner. And try not to spill your container of Wonder Clips like I do. And if you do, at least laugh about it. There goes all my Wonder Clips. I don't know the room on the table here. I'm going to have to pick that up. Once you finish sewing on all of the binding, I recommend sprawling it back out on the floor again, going around the whole perimeter and inspecting it. What you're inspecting for is to make sure that the quilt top was sewn in, that you actually caught the quilt top when you made that stitching line here. I found 2 very, very small spots where I did not. So to correct it, rather than seam rip it and redo the whole thing, which would be extremely cumbersome, I just did a second line. You can see the original black line, and then I came back even closer to the edge to make sure that I caught the quilt top fabric, the red. You can see why this happened in this area. It is pretty puckered here because the wool got too close to the edge. So it was, like I said, just pretty minor. Probably wouldn't have even needed to go back and repair it, but I'd just rather do it now rather than have to do it later. When I finish a quilt, I like to make a personalized label to go on the back of it. So what I like to do is I will cut out approximately a 2" by 6" rectangle. I'm going to choose the fabric that I used for the backing of the quilt so that it matches. And I like to iron on some interfacing. This is just to stabilize the fabric and make it a little bit thicker. Then what I will do is take it to my sewing machine and I will embroider my name on the quilt and the date that I made it. So let's go ahead and iron on the interfacing. This interfacing, there's different levels of quality for the interfacing. This is pretty much the lowest quality, so it's very thin. So it's not adding a ton of thickness to it, but just a little bit. So I'm just going to hold this hot iron on here. This happens to be iron on interfacing. But just to give it a little bit of stability for the embroidering process. Once I make this label, I will hand stitch it onto the back of the quilt. And I usually choose to do it on the lower left or lower right corner of the quilt. I think we put an awful lot of work into our quilts. They're really quite an heirloom piece, in my opinion. And I want to know who made the quilt and what date the quilt was made. This seemed to adhere just well, so I will let this cool down. And I want to take you over to my brother's sewing machine here. And I just want to show you, so I do not have an embroidery machine per se, But this particular Brother model, the SQ9285, does have some limited embroidery options. So I'm able to stitch these letters in the alphabet, and you can also do some numbers as well. I finished making my embroidered label for the back of the quilt. I'll be using black thread since the label itself is black, as is the blacking, so everything blends in nicely. I also recommend choosing a contrasting color when you do embroider your label. In this case, I just used white against the black. Other quilts I've made were a hot pink label, and I used lime green thread. So just something that highly contrasts, so you can really read it easily. And then I like to take my label and hand stitch it to the quilt backing. Now I'm not a cross stitcher, so I'm not doing anything fancy here. I think this is called a whip stitch, I'm not really sure. But regardless, it's a very basic stitch. Of course, with the matching thread color, it's pretty discreet. And here's a close-up of the finished label after it's been attached. Now that my quilt is finished, I'm going to lint roll the whole quilt. It's winter right now, so I can't wash it. To learn how to wash my quilts, I do have a video on that, so be sure to check it out. But in the meantime, we're going to lint roll this. I'm using a Scotch-Brite Everyday Clean lint roller. You can get these anywhere. You can see I have 3 of them. We're going to use quite a few sheets here. It's been on my basement floor. I made this on a cement floor in my basement where I typically have my firewood. It's kind of dirty, so this is the best we can do in the wintertime. So start by peeling your sheet off. So this one here is used. Find the edge. Go ahead and peel that off. And each sheet has a little perforation on it. And that will go in the trash. So we're going to be starting on the top. And we're just going to start rolling with this. You can already see on the black binding here how much lint it's picking off. See how white this looks here? Once I take the lint roller on that, it's a nice clean black. So it's pretty darn dirty. Like I said, it's been on my basement floor. So I'm going to go over this entire quilt many, many times. Once I have the top of the quilt here finished, I will go over the back side as well, until I feel it's as clean as it can be. And I will be washing this quilt in the summertime. So of course these sheets will fill up with lint and it will start to lose its stickiness. Of course it's picking up all the little fine lint. It's also picking up, stray thread here as well. So we're going to go through lots of sheets, but that's okay, it's worth it. We want our all this hard work we put into making these quilts, we want it to look fantastic when we're done with it and take good care of it. And I can't wait to throw it up on the bed and see how it looks for the grand finale. Look how many sheets of lint rollers I went through. It was really dirty. And now the grand finale, the finished quilt on the bed. It's a totally different look than what I usually do. With my traditional, usually very artsy quilt blocks. The panel quilt is definitely a different look. It was fun. It was quick compared to doing blocks. And what a great way to show off the Farmall panels. The binding turned out great. The mitered corners look nice. And the quilt has a wonderful, lofty, and very puffy feel to it. As with all my quilts made with sheep's wool, It's very heavy and will be very warm for those cold Minnesota nights. I hope I've inspired you to try making a quilt like this. Once you make a real wool quilt, you'll never go back. If you made it to the end, thank you. And be sure to check out the video description for any links related to this video. Also, leave a comment. I would love to hear from you.